I am Joya Jefferson Nuri, an ICF certified executive leadership coach. I am honored that all of my clients are Black women who sit in leadership positions. Flying at the top of the world, it is hard to believe they could suffer from the blues. But the blues, commonly defined as depression, is a serious medical illness that negatively affects how you feel, think, and act. It does not always trace back to a life-altering event or be eradicated with medication alone. Depression is that cloud that creeps over your entire existence and often erases your self-worth, stifles your motivation, and leads you to hide in the darkness when you need to be part of the world of help and healing. Being sad is not the same as having depression. Depression is a mood disorder that causes a persistent feeling of sadness and loss. The major symptoms of depression are persistent sadness, anxiety, and that empty mood. Loss of interest or pleasure in hobbies and activities, including sex. Difficulty concentrating, remembering, or making decisions. You may also have a decrease of appetite or an increase of appetite. You're restless and irritable. There's feelings of guilt, worthlessness, helplessness, and pessimism. Depression affects an estimated 1 out of every 15 adults in this country. Today, the stigma on seeking help is lifting. More and more people are transparent about their illness and the assistance they get. On Instagram, there is a poet who writes about depression. The handle is Written by Will, and they write, I feel like a bird with a broken wing, damaged by all the bad I've seen. I want to fly away with you now and feel new things, but I get frustrated that I can't yet, so I just sit. My advice to you is don't just sit. Reach out and tell a trusted friend, clergy, or therapist about your symptoms. You are not a bird with a broken wing. You can fly.
Welcome back to Unerased Black Women Speak. I'm your host, Carolyn Malachi. Today's episode centers depression, and our two distinguished guests were willing to be really candid about it. We begin with Basi Ikpi, a writer and a mental health advocate.
I grew up in Stillwater, Oklahoma. I moved there from Nigeria when I was about a little over 4 years old. And I started writing in the third grade when I was 8, and quite literally because I couldn't draw. And I had a lot of feelings, a lot of emotions, a lot of confusing things going on in my head. And I started writing in order to organize my thoughts. In Oklahoma, in Stillwater, I was able to deal with some of the things that I know now to be depression and anxiety and a little bit of hypomania through writing, being able to write things down. I used to write my parents like these long letters, just trying to plead my case more often than not, but then also just trying to get them to understand something that I was going through that I was having difficult time speaking. I joined the Broadway cast when they did when they started the national international tour. I was actually having this conversation a couple of days ago because of Naomi Osaka. I feel that people are well-meaning when they say everybody should leave her alone and she should be allowed to express whatever she needs to express in any given time. And I understand that and respect that, especially as a Black woman. But as somebody who began to have severe anxiety around performing to the point where I actually passed out on stage twice, like just full-blown anxiety attack, oxygen went, hysterical blindness. Just because you're good at something doesn't mean that thing is good for you. I would have anxiety right before and I'd have anxiety right after. And I had the ability to be on stage and not have that anxiety. So once that anxiety started following me onto the stage, I realized that I had to make a decision about what was more important. And and always, one of the things that I've learned over my journey with my mental health is that the most important thing is my mental wellness. And then also, the fear of, failing and getting on stage and forgetting your lines or going upstage and just like, this is the time they're going to boo you, or, all these things that after X amount of time, if that doesn't go away, to me is a message saying that this is not where I need to be. So if somebody is counting on me or depending on me to do something, and I know that there's a potential there for me, for the anxiety, or for me to even have a depressive episode or a manic episode around that time, I decline. And people will be upset with you at that moment, but it's different than what would happen if you let them down the road. Because another thing that I've learned is that even though my mental health is my personal journey, it does affect the people around me because I don't live on an island by myself.
Bossy, in a New York Times op-ed from July 6, 2019, you provided a detailed description of what your diagnosis, bipolar disorder 2, feels like. Can you share some of that descriptive language to help people better understand what your experience feels like?
Yeah, so that op-ed is actually an edited chapter from my book, and it's from a story called What It Feels Like. And I begin talking about how it feels like being on a Ferris wheel, and how there's like this euphoria and this joy. You're just excited and giddy to be there, and then you get to the very top, and you can see everything, and you feel just like indestructible and just like you could do anything. You can see everything from there. Your vantage point is wider and more vast than anything you've ever experienced. But in a Ferris wheel, eventually the wheel, keeps turning, and you get down and go about your life. But to me, a hypomanic episode is if you stayed up there, you stayed at the top. And at first, it feels great. You feel completely just, it's the best feeling in the world. But after a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, you're still up there. It becomes exhausting. The insomnia comes in, the inability to move because you're stuck up there, right? And there's certain things you can't do from that height. So in that op-ed, in that chapter, I went through a detailed explanation of what a hypomanic episode would feel like, meaning that I wrote about the compulsive shopping, the compulsive thinking. Part of it was, I don't know if it was edited out, but there was part of it where I was talking about how you feel so good about everything and everybody in your life. So you're calling people and you're telling them how much you love them, and you're calling to tell them, how happy you are that they're in your life, and you're, doing all these things, and, you're calling people, but then there might be a point where somebody at this time, after the 18th time you've called them, they're not answering the phone. So on that 18th call, you begin to think, oh, they're mad at me. So now you start calling again in order to apologize for whatever it is that you did to offend them. This thing that you've made up in your mind, but you can't even figure out what that is. And then after the 20th, so that's 40 calls now, you're upset because they're not calling you back. And you're mad at them because how dare they be mad at you and not, give you the common decency to tell you why they're mad. And so you're calling again, this time to cuss them out for doing that. So that's 60 calls now. And then you're calling again because now you feel bad and you have to apologize for the thing that you did and then for being upset with them. And now you're ready to talk. So altogether, that could be, and I'm just making numbers up, that's 100 phone calls. And that happens in 10 minutes. So they didn't have an opportunity to call you back at any of those times, but you've gone through this entire spectrum of feeling and emotions that just exist within your body. And as annoying as that is to that person, it's also physically uncomfortable. It's a physical discomfort because you feel compelled and compulsively moved to do this thing. And if you don't do it, you feel uncomfortable. You feel like there's something crawling in you and you've got to get it out. And the only way to get it out, you've decided, is to call or to, I also had a thing where I had to eat a waffle from every single restaurant that sold waffles in New York City. And that was a thing that happened. But number one, that got me out of the house, but it also was like part of that compulsive, impulsive thinking.
My name is AMJ. My pronouns are they, them, and theirs. I am a queer, Black, crippled, neurodivergent person who was assigned female at birth. I have a master's in social work, and I'm a high school social worker. I have had an interesting time with mental health diagnoses. Actually was one of the earliest AFABs, that's assigned female at birth, to be diagnosed with attention deficit disorder. Being a little girl, I couldn't possibly be autistic too because I was super smart. Did all the things to try to keep me off of meds. Ultimately ended up on meds. Ultimately took myself off of meds. Life came crashing down because of that. So I got some help. Some tech platforms started cropping up specifically for ADHD management. And so I went with one of them and got re-diagnosed and on a new medication. And it's been helpful.
Bossy, when did you learn about self-advocacy, and how's it played a role in your life, especially when it comes to your diagnosis?
My first therapist, my first psychiatrist, both taught me how to self-advocate, and they taught me about wellness and mindfulness, and taught me how to learn to be okay without them. Meaning, if anything happened to them, if they moved, if I moved, which I ended up leaving New York to come to Maryland. I learned very early that it wasn't just about coming to terms with my diagnosis. It was about coming to terms with my life, with the diagnosis as a permanent part of my life. And because of that, I was able to think of it and speak about it in a way that helped. It helped me understand where other people would have trouble with it. And I was able to address that before it needed to be addressed. So I think I told my best friend first and told her that I needed help telling my parents. So she came with me when I told my parents and was able to like translate and explain, because I explained as much as I possibly could to her. My father felt very guilty because when he went and did research and looked at the symptoms, he could go back to when I was 4 years old and check off, and know during points of my life like this and this. And he's like, how could I not have seen this? Like, how did I not, think about this? I was like, well, you don't know what you don't know. So, and I've been very, very fortunate, very, very lucky to have, people in my life that have been very supportive of that. I've also had people who weren't supportive and people who made it difficult for me to be a healthy person. And before I got to the place where I am now, where my mental health is the single most important thing, I was allowing that to color the way that I approached my health, and went through a period of a couple of years where I wasn't taking care of myself. And had to rebuild and start over. And and start the journey over from a place where I needed to stay focused on that. And, it never stays steady. In 2000 and it started 2010, but around 2016, 2015, 2016, I was in the worst depressive episode that I've ever been in my life. Previously, it was mainly like hypomania mixed with depression. But when it was just solely depression, it took a toll on me that I didn't think I was going to survive, didn't think I was going to get out of. But it was because I had prepared the people in my life for this, that they knew exactly what to say to like pull me out of it. They knew exactly what to say to get me to go from, I don't want to be here anymore, to I'm willing to try, but I'm going to prove to you that it's not going to work. And then, slowly I was like, yeah, I'll go to therapy 5 times a week and I'll up my medication, but that's just to prove to you that it's not going to work. And then it ended up working. Whenever a celebrity, comes out with a diagnosis, there's suddenly all this pressure for them to be the voice. And I don't think that's necessary. I think that people should be allowed to deal with it any way they want to deal with it. But I recognize the fact that there were a lot of people who weren't talking about it, and they also weren't treating it. And it was that shame where they couldn't even admit it to themselves. So they definitely couldn't admit it to the people around them. The Kanye conversation has shown me how little people truly understand anything that goes beyond depression and anxiety. But there's so many resources now who are able to do the things that I wanted to do, which is like provide counseling services.
You mentioned that writing a book showed you how much you didn't want to be a writer. So what prompted you to offer to the world, I'm telling the truth, but I'm lying?
Certain things that I was doing, in hindsight, alerted me to the fact that I wasn't okay. And I went to Nigeria for like off and on for 3 years. I said I was working. I just ran away. I told myself I was going there to work and to do all these things, to work in television and to write and to do, but I really just needed to escape. And I thought that a change of scenery would help. And I came back feeling like I'd wasted 3 years of my life and 3 years of my son's life. That was just a little hum, much, much louder, and just kept getting louder and louder when I got home. So I wanted people to understand that and people to know what those experiences were. And I was very lucky to have an editor who supported that and supported the way that I wrote it, which is with a lot of dissociation, where I'm talking in third person. And there are certain parts of the book where I'm in second person, where I'm talking to you as myself, because I wanted the reader to like walk through this. Like I'm talking to you about what you're going through and you're walking through this with me. It also saved my life, because before, where I thought I was a collection of failures, I was also able to see that I was a collection of triumphs as well. Every time I fell, I got right back up. I've had 4 or 5 careers, like solid careers, because I've gotten myself up and I've rebuilt. And yes, I fell, but I got up again and I rebuilt, and I started to change the perspective of how I was looking at who I was and what I wanted to do. So the book just felt like a good punctuation.
You've also called yourself an ex-poet and have shared why. But tell us, as we close out, Basi, what do you see when you look into the future for yourself?
Spiritually, I'm in a place of contentment right now. I learned that happiness isn't the pursuit. Happiness is fleeting. Contentment is more solid, and I strive to be content, and I am. I'm in a very safe and solid place in my life where I'm able to be disappointed and live, and I'm able to be excited and realistic. Like I'm not too far in any direction. I'm even, and I am content.
Thank you, Basi Ikpi. We continue our deep dive into the subject of depression. Our next guest is Lisa Stewart.
My name is Lisa Stewart. I'm a patient advocate, and I primarily work with organizations in setting strategies such that the services that they offer really support the needs, values, and preferences of patients.
Welcome, Lisa. We're organizing our thoughts around the idea of beating back the blues. otherwise known as depression. How has depression impacted your life?
I first heard the word depression as it related to me in a clinical setting in my 20s. And this was after a period that many people would have thought would have been some of the best days of their lives. I'd come out of college, went to a HBCU. I had a great job by many people's standards. I came out of undergraduate school making more money than my parents had made at the top of their careers. And I had this quote unquote bright future ahead of me. And it was in investment banking, which was hot at that time. And it was a career path that was totally misaligned with who I was. And the work required me to suppress large pieces of myself, or so I thought, right, to be successful in it. And at the near end of a 3-year training period where we being the participants in this program, were supposed to move on to, great permanent positions, I basically was falling flat on my face. And so I knew I needed to do something differently. And I start looking, and I was like, At that point in my life, I really needed things to seem linear and make sense, and that moves couldn't be perceived as something that was like some crazy musings of, a young 20-year-old. I always avoided labels, but really it helped me crystallize my experience. Because up until then, my blues were bad in ways that I was trying to cover it up. So the cover up became to be very exhaustive and draining on a very deep level. And then I would have, I learned the terminology later, like I didn't have suicide ideations, but that was a big signal for me to let me go get, start talking to someone.
My name is Octavia Carlos, psychiatric social worker. I'm licensed in Maryland and DC for psychotherapy. What is very different in 2022 is stress and anxiety about all of what's going on in the world, especially COVID, especially mothers trying to protect their children. And with the stress that is involved with being aligned with COVID, following feeling out of control, mismanaged, isolation, very serious change in lifestyle. There is an awful lot of Black women coming into therapy, actually not necessarily knowing what is going on with them. They just talk about stress and they talk about problems in their relationship because that's how it manufactures itself, very different from 20 years ago. The biggest thing 20 years ago was stress, but on a different level. It was women that were beginning to see themselves as viable and moving up in the world, because I had many people working from Fortune 500 companies and feeling like they've got to work 2 and 3 times more than their counterparts. Black women, at least in my case, have always come for counseling. They have always said, I need help. We believe that we've got to be able to be the ones that handle everything. The depression that actually needs treatment are the things that, the symptoms that don't go away. Stress can become depression once we feel overwhelmed and unable to cope with something we are feeling unable to master. And so when you can have a plan to master whatever the situation is, you can feel empowered, which makes you feel better.
Lisa, how did talking to someone affect your perception of depression?
Once I start exploring my own state of being, I saw the world differently. I saw that depression was all around me. Intergenerational patterns of alcoholism in my family. It was showing up in abusive relationships. It was just showing up. We find ourselves in social isolation, particularly when we need most our relationships and people. And so in depression, it's very easy to sit in your home and not talk to anyone, have the lights out, not be engaged. Those are exactly the moments in which you need to engage with folk. It's kind of like you go to a exercise class and someone says, oh, the day that you don't want to go is the day you need to go the most. It's very similar in my mind in that way. And that requires a lot of people moving past the shame, all the layers of the stigma that are associated with it, but also applying the energy. And that's also often what you lose in depression is the kind of the energy and life force to do that. We know that there's many stressors on our lives, particularly Black women. It sometimes may feel oversaid, but looking to being true to ourselves and looking towards our passions and truly what makes us happy. I was studying anthropology. There's a concept called soul loss that appears in many cultures. Something happens to a person, and then a piece of the soul, to preserve it, goes elsewhere as a means of self-preservation. Because the trauma, to spare the soul, you have to separate pieces of it. We come from a legacy of trauma. We have to do that work and focus work of being truly in alignment with who we think we are.
Thank you, Lisa. Before you go, we're really curious to know, what brings you joy today?
I'm working on that.
Thanks for listening to Unerased Black Women Speak, made possible by support from the Craig Newmark Philanthropies, the Park Foundation, TD Charitable Foundation, and anonymous donors. Our theme song is Unerased by Carolyn Malachi. We had help from Joya Jefferson Nuri, Joshua Levi Perrin, recording engineer Ashley Donald, Alyssa Davis, Alex Kavoris, Jovita Hill, Rosemary Mealy, Marisol Bello, Stephanie Renee, and social media coordinators Antoinette Miner and April McKellar Perry. Our audio producer and host is Carolyn Malachi. Gwen McKinney is our creator and executive producer. All of us at Unerased Black Women Speak invite you to tune in to our next episode. While you're there, please subscribe and visit us online at unerasedbws.com.